J.D. Vance, a name that has become synonymous with political debates and discussions. A U.S. senator, public figure, and a person who often finds himself in the eye of the storm. But what if this time, J.D. Vance wasn't here to stir up controversy? What if he was just another man, looking for a quiet meal after a long, tiring day? It was supposed to be a simple visit to a small diner in Springfield, Ohio. The kind of diner where the neon lights flicker softly and the smell of grilled burgers fills the air. But what awaited J.D. inside this humble establishment would shock him and everyone around him. The story you're about to hear isn't just about one man's rejection. It's about how a simple meal turned into a defining moment, not just for J.D., but for everyone who witnessed it. The question is, what did he do when he was turned away? Stay with me as we uncover the shocking truth behind what happened next. It was a typical evening in Springfield, Ohio, a small town known for its tight-knit community and old-fashioned charm. As J.D. Vance's car pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, he sighed in relief. The day had been long, filled with back-to-back meetings, policy discussions, and handshakes. He was exhausted, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. All he wanted was a simple meal, a moment of peace before he had to drive back. The diner, a modest establishment, stood at the corner of a quiet street. Its flickering neon sign was the only sign of life in the otherwise still town. The hum of conversation, the sizzle of burgers on the grill, and the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee all called to him as he stepped through the door. The bell above the door jingled as J.D. entered, the warmth of the diner enveloping him. The place was small but inviting, a stark contrast to the hectic world outside. A handful of regulars sat in the booths, some reading newspapers, others chatting softly over coffee. It had that classic diner vibe. Pictures of past patrons pinned to the walls, a few faded Polaroids capturing the diner's long history. J.D. caught the hostess's eye, a middle-aged woman with a friendly smile. But as soon as she saw him, her smile faltered, just for a brief moment. He noticed it, a hesitation, an uncertainty that passed so quickly, but not unnoticed. She quickly masked it with a forced smile, asking if he was dining in or taking out. J.D., sensing the oddness in the air but not wanting to make it a big deal, smiled back and said, "Dining in, if that's all right." The hostess nodded, but there was something in the way she paused, something that made J.D.'s instincts flare. It was subtle, almost invisible, but J.D. knew enough to recognize when people weren't entirely comfortable. He scanned the room, and sure enough, the diners had started to notice him. One man, halfway through his burger, leaned in and whispered something to his companion. Another woman, wearing a flannel shirt, placed her coffee cup down with a little too much force, her eyes narrowing for a brief second before she looked away. It was becoming clear. Something wasn't quite right here. J.D. wasn't naive. He'd been in enough rooms, shaken enough hands, to know when he wasn't entirely welcome. This was one of those times. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted. What was once a peaceful, quiet place was now filled with a quiet, uncomfortable tension. The hostess, still with that thin smile on her face, glanced nervously over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at J.D. Her eyes seemed to dart around the room, as if looking for reassurance from the other customers. But there was no reassurance to be found. "Just one moment," she said, her voice a little more strained now. She quickly disappeared through the swinging doors into the kitchen, leaving J.D. standing there alone. The second she stepped away, J.D. could feel the eyes of the diner turning toward him. A man at the counter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Someone muttered something under their breath, too quiet for J.D. to catch, but loud enough for him to notice. There was something about the atmosphere now, thick, almost palpable. J.D. exhaled slowly and rolled his shoulders back, trying to shake off the tension in the air. He wasn't going to make a scene. He wasn't going to assume anything, but something didn't sit right with him. The hostess had seemed too eager to disappear, the way the other customers looked at him. It was all too strange. He waited. The seconds ticked by, stretching into what felt like minutes. From behind the kitchen door, muffled voices rose and fell, too indistinct for J.D. to understand. He stood there, hands in his pockets, trying to keep his composure. The quiet murmurs and glances from the other patrons continued, But JD wasn't going to give in to the discomfort. He had been in enough awkward situations, political debates, tense meetings, interviews designed to trip him up. But there was something different about this. This wasn't just a debate or a policy discussion. This was personal. It was about being rejected by a simple, local diner, a place where people went to eat and relax. JD couldn't help but wonder, was this what it felt like for regular people, the ones he often spoke about in his speeches? Rejection for who they were, based on nothing more than the labels others had placed on them? The hostess returned after what seemed like an eternity. This time, her expression had shifted. Gone was the nervousness, replaced by something firmer, almost resolute. She stepped toward JD with a determination that made him pause. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice now much more controlled. "We can't serve you tonight." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. For a moment, JD didn't respond. The entire diner seemed to go silent, not quiet, but quiet enough for the sizzle of the grill and the clinking of silverware to fill the space in an unnervingly hollow way. JD stared at the hostess, his mind racing to make sense of what she was saying. "I'm sorry, did I do something wrong?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even calm. He didn't want to escalate things, but the tension was building inside him. This wasn't just about a meal anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and something that went deeper than just a simple rejection. The hostess didn't flinch, but her lips tightened. She didn't offer an explanation, no reason, no apology, just the cold finality of her words. "We'd rather not serve you tonight," she said again, her voice firm, though not hostile. There was no hesitation this time, no warmth, just a flat, dismissive tone that made it clear this wasn't a matter of policy or business. It was personal. JD could feel the eyes of the room on him now, every diner watching with a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and in some cases, what seemed like quiet satisfaction. The usual hum of conversation had stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. A fork scraped against a plate, but it was distant, almost out of place in the new atmosphere that had enveloped the diner. He took a deep breath. The situation was more complicated than it seemed, and the weight of it settled over him like a heavy fog. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of rejection, especially not in a place as simple as a diner. But there was no way around it. This was happening, and he had to decide how to respond. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the words sink in. The hostess wasn't looking at him anymore. She had already turned her gaze elsewhere, and JD noticed a few heads turned in his direction. A man at the counter muttered something, barely audible. The woman in the flannel shirt shot him a quick glance, and the younger man in the booth still sat with his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving JD. The rejection was clear, but what JD did next would surprise everyone. JD stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The diner had become an arena, and he had a choice to make. He could walk away, let it slide, and let everyone assume what they would. Or he could challenge the rejection. He could call them out, create a scene, make this a headline. But as tempting as that might have been, something inside him told him that wasn't the right choice. Instead of getting angry, instead of demanding an explanation or letting his pride take control, JD did something unexpected. He took a breath, steadied his thoughts, and simply said, "All right, can I speak with the manager?" The hostess hesitated, her eyes darting toward the kitchen, as if seeking silent approval from someone else in the back. There was a brief moment of indecision, and JD could see that the situation was uncomfortable for everyone in the room, not just him. The older man at the counter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and the younger guy in the booth, who had been watching with crossed arms, seemed to be waiting for something, anything to happen. The hostess nodded slowly, her lips pressed together in a thin line, before disappearing into the kitchen once more. JD stood there, quietly waiting. A few moments passed, and the room seemed to settle into a kind of anticipatory silence. The usual buzz of the diner had been replaced by an almost eerie stillness, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Then, through the swinging kitchen doors, emerged a man in his early 50s. Broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron, he had an air of authority about him. His name tag read Don. Don didn't greet JD, or even ask what he wanted. Instead, he gave him a long, hard look, sizing him up before finally speaking. "I hear you've got a question," he said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. There was no welcome in his tone, just a challenge. It was clear from the way he stood that he wasn't here to make friends. He was here to set things straight. J.D., calm and measured as always, met Don's gaze steadily. "Yes," he replied, his voice even. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don shifted on his feet, looking away for a moment before returning his gaze to J.D. He wiped his hands on his apron, his eyes scanning the few remaining patrons in the diner, all of whom were watching this exchange with bated breath. "This ain't personal," Don said finally, his voice more subdued now. "But people around here, they got their opinions about you, about what you stand for." He paused, almost as if he were weighing his words. "I got a business to run. I don't want trouble, and I sure as hell don't want no one making a scene in my diner." J.D. listened carefully, not interrupting, taking in every word. It wasn't what he had expected, but he understood it. This wasn't about the meal. It wasn't about the service. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond the diner walls. The younger man in the booth, who had been watching the whole scene unfold, couldn't resist anymore. With a smirk, he leaned forward and piped up, "I mean, you don't belong here, man. People don't want you around." J.D. turned his head toward the younger man, his expression calm but serious. He didn't react to the taunts, didn't let the provocation get under his skin. Instead, he turned back to Don, focusing on him. Don stood there, still tense, but the air had shifted. J.D. wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't arguing, and for the first time, Don seemed uncertain. J.D., now fully aware of the tension in the room, took a step back and exhaled slowly. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to get into a shouting match. But he also wasn't going to let this moment slip by without trying to understand the root of it. He leaned in slightly, making eye contact with Don, and asked, "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this? Or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don hesitated for a moment, his fingers tightening around the back of the chair he was leaning on. It was clear that the question had caught him off guard. For the first time, Don's usual certainty seemed to waver. He looked over his shoulder toward the kitchen, as if searching for some kind of guidance or confirmation from someone back there. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, more uncertain. I just don't want things to get ugly," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to J.D. before darting away again. "People around here have strong opinions, and I have to think about my business, my employees. I don't want any trouble." J.D. nodded, taking in Don's words. The weight of the situation wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about a meal. It was about the unspoken pressure of living in a town that had its own rules, its own judgments, and expectations. J.D. could feel that weight, too. He had dealt with it his whole life, in one form or another. He wasn't here to force anyone's hand. He was here to understand. He didn't argue with Don. Instead, J.D. leaned back slightly, folding his arms across his chest, and asked another question, this one quieter but just as pointed. "If I wasn't who I am, if I were just some guy walking in here, would we even be having this conversation?" Don's eyes met J.D.'s again, this time with a mix of wariness and thoughtfulness. It was almost as if he was considering the question for the first time. But then, before he could respond, the younger man in the booth spoke up, his voice laced with impatience. "This isn't about whether you're a regular guy or not," the younger man said, shaking his head dismissively. "It's about who you are, what you stand for. People don't like you. You can't change that." J.D. took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving Don's. He was used to hearing this kind of sentiment. Politics often didn't leave room for nuance or understanding. People made assumptions, and those assumptions became facts in their minds. But J.D. wasn't about to accept that as the end of the conversation. He wasn't just going to walk away. He looked back at Don, his voice calm but insistent. "Look, I get it," J.D. said. "I really do. But you don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. So I'll ask you this. If I was just a regular guy, would you still be making the same judgment? Or is this just about politics?" Don opened his mouth as if to respond, but the words didn't come. For a moment, the room was silent again, the tension hanging heavy in the air. JD let the silence stretch, letting it sink in that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to this than politics. More to Don than just a business owner trying to avoid conflict. The younger guy, still watching the exchange from his booth, looked like he wanted to say something more, but his expression had shifted. He no longer looked quite so certain. His arms were uncrossed now, his body leaning forward, clearly listening, not sure what to make of JD's calm response. Don's fingers tapped against the back of the chair again, his gaze flicking toward the kitchen. The moment seemed to stretch, but then Don sighed deeply. "All right," he said, his voice still reluctant but softer now. "You want to know what people really think. They think you're full of it. You talk about working-class people, but you don't act like it. You say things, make promises, but when it comes down to it, nothing ever changes." As JD sat in the booth, finishing his meal, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had just happened. What was supposed to be a simple stop at a local diner had turned into something far more significant. It wasn't just about a meal or a political point. It was about understanding the invisible lines that separated people, the unspoken divisions that ran deep, and the struggles that often went unnoticed. The younger man, who had been so eager to challenge him, no longer seemed so sure of himself. JD could feel his gaze shifting, no longer filled with sharp criticism, but with a kind of doubt, perhaps even curiosity. His body language had changed, too. He was no longer lounging in the booth, arms crossed defensively. Now he sat up straighter, his expression thoughtful. The room had shifted. The uncomfortable silence had given way to a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. People were still talking, still eating, but the edge was gone. Even the man at the counter who had spoken earlier, the one who had shared his years of hardship in the factory, seemed to be a little more at ease. He glanced up from his coffee, nodding in JD's direction as if acknowledging that something had shifted. Maybe not in the world, but at least in this little corner of it. JD took another sip of his coffee, nodding in return. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. For once, the words between him and the people in this diner weren't just about division. They were about understanding. Even the atmosphere in the room had changed. The tension that had been thick and palpable just a short while ago had given way to something that felt more like a conversation. No one was shouting. No one was demanding answers. They were listening, and that was enough. The waitress, Mary, came over to refill his coffee, glancing at him with a slightly softer expression than before. "We make it strong here," she said, almost with a sense of pride. JD smiled, raising an eyebrow at her and taking a sip. "I can tell," he replied dryly, a small grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time, the laughter in the diner was genuine, not forced or uncomfortable, but real. The younger man, now looking somewhat less hostile, let out a small chuckle. Even Don, who had been so firm and resistant at the start, was shaking his head, a smile playing on his lips. The cooks in the kitchen were back to work, the sound of sizzling food filling the air as the evening's routine resumed. The tension had cracked, not completely, but enough to let the normalcy return. JD could feel that something had shifted, not just in the diner, but in himself as well. He had been tested. His patience, his composure, and his willingness to listen had all been pushed to their limits. But in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about having the conversation, staying present, and showing up when it mattered most. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for tonight. As he finished his meal, JD knew the road ahead would still be full of challenges. There would be more people to face, more questions to answer, and more decisions to make. But for this brief moment, in this small diner, he had managed to change the tone of the conversation. He had turned a moment of rejection into an opportunity for understanding, and that was something worth holding on to. "Thanks for the meal," JD said as he stood up, his voice sincere. He gave Don a nod of respect, and Don, despite all the earlier tension, returned it with a small, acknowledging tilt of his head. "I'll see you around," JD added, before turning toward the door. The bell above the door jingled once again as he stepped out into the night. The world outside hadn't changed, at least not yet, but for the first time, JD felt like maybe it was just a little bit closer to understanding. As the door closed behind him, the diner settled back into its quiet rhythm. The moment of tension passed, but the conversation lingering in the air. As JD stepped outside into the cool night air, the weight of the evening settled on him. The quiet streets of Springfield felt different now. The tension, the anger, the frustration that had been so thick inside the diner, it was all behind him. But he knew that, in some way, it wasn't just behind him. It was something that would stay with him, something that had shifted not just in the diner, but in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. He could have walked away. He could have thrown up his hands and stormed out the moment he was rejected, demanding answers, making it a spectacle. He could have made sure this incident became another headline, another political firestorm. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed. He listened. He had the conversation no one expected, and in doing so, he had shown that sometimes the real power isn't in winning an argument or making a point. It's in staying, in listening, and in showing up when others might have walked away. As JD got into his car and started the engine, he glanced back at the diner. It was a small place, just another spot in another town. But for tonight, it had become something more. It had become a place where a simple conversation had managed to bridge a divide, even if just for a moment. A place where, for the first time in a long while, people had actually listened to each other, despite their differences. And as he drove away, he knew that, in a world that often seemed divided, this small exchange in a quiet diner was a rare reminder. Sometimes, change doesn't come through speeches or policies, or even grand gestures. Sometimes, it comes through something as simple as sitting down, listening, and acknowledging the humanity in each other. The road ahead would be full of challenges, full of people who would continue to judge, to criticize, to draw lines. But JD had learned something important tonight. Sometimes, those lines could be blurred, just a little bit, if people were willing to step across them. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. If you've ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between walking away or staying to listen, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your experience. Let's talk about how these moments of understanding, even small ones, can make a difference. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you until next time.